Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 10 video. Today's video will be a countdown of the top champions for ranked play in patch 11.18. Initially, the meta was heavily dominated by champions like Yasuo and Kha'zix, but the B patch changed that and now the meta is quite diverse. Because of that, there's no champions that are absolutely defining the meta post B patch. That means the power of each champion on the list is comparable, with the number 1 champion being just as viable as the 1 in 10th. With all that said, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our top 10, we have the legendary Chug Jug himself coming in at number 10, Gragas. Doing well in the early game is a key to succeeding in TFT. That means it's important to recognize what champions and synergies give you the potential strongest board to play so that you can win streak or at least mitigate damage taken. Gragas, the old Chug Jug, has been one of those champions since the dawn of Set 5, and in the current meta, he exemplifies that role more so than any other early game frontline champion. And of course, we have to acknowledge that because of the Chug Jug composition, as well as the Chug Bug, we are weighing Gragas a bit more so than other frontline champions. After all, those two compositions help define the first week of 11.18. Gragas on his own is quite good thanks to his damage reduction of his ability, but his traits also increase his value quite a bit. Early game brawlers, amazing frontline. Dawnbringer, one of the best early game traits. Put all of those factors together and it should be no surprise that Gragas is doing well in the meta. That said, Gragas doesn't scale all that well into the late game even if you 3-star him and have items. Giant Slayer is also highly effective against him since the bonus damage is guaranteed. Despite those downsides, Gragas should always be on a player's early game radar as a potential pickup for their board, especially if they're in need of a frontline. Keeping the Dawnbringer theme going, the number 9 champion is actually a pair with Nidalee and Riven. The reason for pairing these two champions together is that, for the most part, Nidalee and Riven fulfill a similar role. Both of them are early to mid-game item holders that are pivoted out of later on in the game. Both are Dawnbringers, so the boards you play with them are often similar, as both are auto-attack focused. Of course, there are differences between the two champions. Nidalee can hold a wider range of items such as Rage Blade or even some AP items, while Riven primarily works best with generic AD items like Deathblade and Bloodthirster. Another difference is that Nidalee isn't played much beyond stage 4, whereas Riven can be used as a carry throughout the whole game. But since both champions were nerfed a few patches ago, neither of them seem to scale all that well into the late game. As you said with Gragas, the early game is quite important. Being able to play a proper item holder is as essential to playing a strong board as a frontline is. Both Riven and Nidalee are great for that, especially in a meta that favors early Dawnbringer. Overall, it doesn't matter whether you use Nidalee or Riven, as both of them are viable options. Let's move on to the next champion, coming in at number 8, Velkaz. Unfortunately for any fans of AP compositions, there's not too many options in the current meta. One major reason for that is how difficult it can be to get late game AP champions working effectively. For example, Heimerdinger isn't viable until level 2 and needs proper items to cast. Since they increased Heimerdinger's mana pool at level 1, it's not just possible for them to cast early enough in a fight to do enough damage. Karma is viable but struggles unless the right conditions are met, and even then she can be hard countered by Dragon's Claw. Thankfully for Karma, Dawnbringer is doing well, so she has a place in the meta. But as far as carries go, Velkaz is the only AP champion that is consistently doing well. And even then, it can be a struggle because Velkaz is so dependent upon proper positioning that the mid-game can often result in a bunch of coin flips if he's on the wrong side of the board. Downsides aside, Velkaz at least stabilizes well in the mid-game with an Abomination board backing him up. The amount of damage he can do, especially when positioned well, makes up for a lot of his shortcomings as a champion. So when it comes down to it, if you're the type of player that favors AP comps, Velkaz is the champion to play for. Up next, we have Khazix coming in at number 7. We've talked about the Chug Jug, and now it's time for Chug Bug. Kha'zix absolutely dominated the first week of 11.18, which resulted in several nerfs coming his way in the B patch. Somehow, some way, despite multiple nerfs in the B patch, Kha'zix is still chugging along just fine in the meta. The reason for that is while they did lower his damage and nerf the assassin trait, Kha'zix 3 essentially still one-shots any isolated unit. It doesn't matter if he does 150 less damage, the target is still taking over 100% of their health from one ability. That said, yes, the nerfs have played a part in reducing the effectiveness of Kha'zix. Previously, a player could say, "Me Chug Bug, no pivot." Now it's more likely that the player needs a good opening to play Kha'zix. Hard forcing is less likely to succeed, which is an overall good thing. Still, the fact that Kha'Zix 3 is still doing well is a testament to how good the champion can be, particularly with a Gragas 3. All in all, Kha'Zix 3 isn't a guaranteed win, especially after the nerfs. If you have a good opening for him, it's still worthwhile to use as a main carry within the Chug Bug role composition. Switching to a late game champion, we have Kale coming in at number 6. While the pace of the game still favors the mid game thanks to the B patch, it is once again viable to play slower and focus on the late game. Because of that, Kale is back on the menu as a potential late game carry. While there are other options, no other champion scales quite as well as Kale does into the late game. It's just reaching that point of the game that can be tricky. Kha'Zix is certainly an issue for Kale because of the isolation damage, but not too many other compositions are hard counters to that late game Kale board. This is thanks to the defensive nature of Redeem paired with synergies like Knight, Ironclad, and Mystic. Kale herself is a bit weak initially in the fight, but ramps up and becomes much harder to deal with for most boards. Problem, of course, is reaching that state of the game with enough health to hit Kale too, plus the other champions necessary to protect her. As we said, the B patch did help a lot because the nerfs did lessen the power spike of mid-game boards, particularly for champions like Yasuo and compositions like Chug Bug. Playing for a fast 8 is viable again, which makes Kale much more likely to come online. In general, we're rating Kale a bit higher than some of the other champions because of her scaling, but keep in mind, Kale isn't an easy champion to pull off every game. Up next is a champion that truly dominated the first week of 11-18, coming in at number 5, Yasuo. Yasuo. This champion has been through it all in set 5, from being borderline unplayable to completely overpowered. Somehow, after multiple patches in a row of being nerfed, Yasuo returned to glory in 11-18 after they reduced the casting time of his ability. But they also nerfed other aspects of the meta, so it was really the perfect storm of balance adjustments that came together for Yasuo to take over. Naturally, this led to a B patch where they, rightfully, nerfed Yasuo. At first, it seemed like they went too hard on the nerfs, but after a few days of the patch being out, it seemed like Yasuo was still viable. Certainly not overpowered, but playable and can still carry if you 3-star him. Overall, his power still resides mostly in the mid-game, but throughout the game, Yasuo is still viable, despite those nerfs. The main reason why we're listing Yasuo at number 5 is the influence he had on the meta leading up to the B patch. It also helps that he's still relevant after the nerfs, but even if he was much weaker, we'd still have him on the list just for how absolutely dominant he was in the first half of 11-18. Still all around a good champion, just not completely overpowered. Next is another Nightbringer champion coming in at number 4, Diana. We're at the point of the top 10 where generally the champions listed are defining the meta. But the B patch changed the meta enough that there's not really any one champion doing exceedingly well over the other. Instead, we're going to focus on champions that have an impact across multiple compositions, even though they aren't insanely strong like the pre-nerf Yasuo or Kha'Zix. Diana is one of those champions because of how well she functions in multiple boards as a means to disrupt the enemy backline. Even without items, as long as she gets one cast off per fight, it increases the odds of winning the round. With items, particularly Frozen Heart, Diana becomes an absolute menace to the enemy carry. The downside to Diana is that with Yasuo nerfed, Nightbringer compositions are a bit less common, particularly since Aphelios is hit or miss currently. Plus, Assassins also took a hit. Still, if you have an extra slot and can play any champion that shares the trait with Diana, it's worth it to run her on your board. Another champion fitting the general theme of the top 4 is Teemo, who comes in at number 3. Teemo is the counter to late game AD compositions regardless of what board you're running. Main issue is affording to buy him because he costs health. If a player is too low on health, it's just not worth the investment to pick up Teemo. That means in general, Teemo is going to help those who are already winning, basically to win more. Another benefit of Teemo is Cruel. Cruel isn't a consistent trait to rely on, but it does help win key fights where a player would have lost, saving them health. All in all, Teemo can be difficult to use late game for multiple reasons, but any player that is able to use him is likely going to be in a better spot than the rest of the lobby. Coming in at number 2, we have Galio. Galio took a hit in the 11-18 patch with a few nerfs, both to his ability and the items he used. Initially, it looked like those nerfs were going to be a bit too much, as Sentinels and Knights weren't all that popular at the beginning of 11-18. Part of that is due to Yasuo and Vayne, both of which do true damage and ignore the defenses of champions like Galio. Another issue was the pace of the game, as Sentinel and Knight boards tend to lean towards the mid to late game. Yasuo and Vayne receiving nerfs, plus the pace of the game being not quite as fast anymore after the B patch, we're seeing Galio return to the forefront of the frontline meta. Both with and without Sentinels, Galio plays a key role in stalling out the enemy by surviving much longer than other frontline champions normally do. Especially with the nerfs to Revenant, Galio is more relevant than ever. And finally, for our number 1 champion of patch 11.18, we have Rell. Again, we want to preface this by saying that the top 4 of this list are not all champions that dominate the meta. We're focused on consistency and flexibility, and few other champions are as consistent and flexible as Rell. Whether you use her with Ironclad, Cavalier, or Redeemed, Rell can generally find a spot on any board as a key frontline champion. With shields and an AoE stun, she brings a lot of value as a standalone champ. We've talked about Rell ad nauseum in the past, so we won't ramble on much longer. All we'll say is that if your board lacks a frontline, Rell is one of the best champions to use. That's it for our top 10 champions of patch 11.18. Normally we would have honorable mentions at this point, but honestly there's just too many to list as the current meta is quite diverse. Just a few we could talk about are Vayne, Draven, Akshan, Gwen, and the duo of Revenants with Ivern and Volibear. But there are so many others worth discussing that we'll leave this week's list at just our top 10 champions. Alright folks, that's all we've got for you for today. As we've said, there's a lot of viable champions in the meta after the B patch. Sure, the meta is skewed a bit towards the early and mid game, but the pace of the game is slowed down enough that plenty of late game champions are becoming viable once again. Let us know in the comment section below what champions you've been having success with. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.